Okay, so we're starting Module 8, and Module 8 focuses on human rights violations that occurred in the post-Cold War era. We're going to concentrate on the time period right at the end of the Cold War in 1990-91 up until 9/11, basically. And there's a lot to talk about here, so I'm going to focus in on the issue of identity and the issue of nationalism and how that's a recipe for human rights violations. So first we have to understand the concept of identity. And so when you're asked, where are you from, what do you identify with? The society that we're from. I'm a Texan, I'm a New Yorker. What do you say if you're from Utah? I think they're called Utes, right? So you're an American. And so we kind of think about this term of a society, and this is a broad term that refers to complex human organizations. It's a collection of people that are bound by some shared institutions that define how we're supposed to relate to one another. So we talk about societal norms, okay? What if you're from Europe? Do you say I'm European? Well, probably not. In spite of an effort for a unified Europe, most Europeans still identify themselves more specifically as I'm French, or I'm Italian, or I'm German. We all like to and can identify with some group of people. Well, how about within a particular state? I mean, if we think about the United States, as a country, most people don't say, I'm from the United States. They usually say where they're from. I'm from Texas, right? I'm from California. I'm a New Yorker. So there's one way geographically to talk about your identity, but another way to identify yourself is through your race or ethnicity. So your ethnic identity is one way that we can identify or talk about groups within a society. And so think about any specific attribute or societal institutions that make one group of people culturally different than others. Is it their language? Is it their religion? Is it their geography, customs, history? Okay. And these things are largely fixed during our lives. And so we can think of some ethnic groups from some countries that we can look and see if they have a multi-ethnic they have a multi-ethnic background. Of course, then there's religious identity as well. This idea that you're going to be separated based on your faith. And then sometimes identity is what we call a social construct. It is constructed by others in a social environment to be able to differentiate between people. So this is where we start to get some very nationalistic some very nationalistic attitudes about identity. And so if we want to think about what do we mean by nationalism and how is that particularly different than patriotism, nationalism is this idea or ideology that holds that the nation, that is the people, should be the only object of political loyalty of individuals. So if we use this word nation state a lot, but a nation refers to the people, the state refers to the government. So a nationalist movement is really based on the idea that individuals are more likely to hold an allegiance to the nation rather than to the state. So patriotism is loyalty to the state. So we kind of think about nationalism as pride in one's people, and it seeks to create or preserve one's own nation of people through an independent state normally. So we can kind of think about the difference between nationalism and patriotism. And patriotism is really easy to garner support for. So the people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. It's easy. All you have to do is tell them that they're being attacked and denounce the peacemakers for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. And that works in any country. Okay. So how do we identify people? These are just some examples by ethnicity. If we look at the country of India, for example, these are the different major ethnic groups in India. The Indo-Aryan versus the Dravidian. Okay, and then there's a small smattering of others. In China, 92% of the people in Chinese have an ethnic identity of Han Chinese. And then you have 8% of very smaller groups of ethnicity. Okay. In Mexico, if we think about the different ethnic groups, it's far more multi-ethnic here, where you have three different major groups here. In South Africa, we read about apartheid in module number 5. 75% of the individuals in South Africa are black, with 13% white, and then others. Japan is probably one of the most ethnically monolithic countries, if you will, with Japanese making up 99% ethnically of the population of Japan. And then, of course, you can find some countries that have a lot of different ethnic groups, which makes, of course, governing very difficult. Brazil. Brazil is going to be the site of the next Summer Olympic Games as well as the World Cup. And so Brazil has a very wide, diverse population, 55% white. These are the Portuguese ancestry, mixed white and black others. And so you have a blending of Native Americans, slaves, Europeans. It says, unlike much of Spanish America in the United States, there was far more intermarriage among racial groups in Brazil. And so 40% almost consider themselves to be of mixed race. And so, but there is this discrimination. Despite the Brazilian myth of racial democracy, there's a strong association between race and wealth, with wealthy Brazilians tending to be lighter skinned, and darker skinned blacks are proportionally present among Brazil's poor. And so there is this ethnic identity that has social consequences, economic consequences, political consequences. All right, so ethnicity is a huge way that we identify ourselves. Okay, I'm not sure what that's about. All right, religion is another way of identifying ourselves. We're going to dive more into the case of the former Yugoslavia in a little bit, but here's a case where religion makes a difference. And so what this map is showing you is by color where the different groups are predominant. So you have Serbs, this is the green, and these individuals are Orthodox, more related to their brethren toward the east, the Russian Orthodox. The darker green colors, kind of a more khaki, army green, these pockets, these are the Slavic Muslims. These are individuals who are Muslim, obviously, who have lived in this region forever, and they are the minority group, and this is the group that faced ethnic cleansing. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Croats are in the mustard yellow, and these folks' religion is Catholicism, as are the Slovenians. And then Albanians, there is a mix of Albanian Muslims as well as non-Muslims living in Kosovo. Okay, and so this is a way to differentiate identity based on your faith. Okay. And then we have ethnicity as a social construct, and we'll talk about the Rwandan genocide in a separate lecture, but basically this is the case that the Belgians who colonized the region in Africa of Rwanda really started to stress the difference between ethnic tribes, and they issued identity cards and favored the minority Tutsis, and by minority I mean in terms of numbers. Tutsis only made up 15% of the population, but they received preferential treatment in terms of education, in terms of professional opportunities, administrative opportunities, and the governance, local and state, as opposed to the Hutus, which constituted 85% of the population, but were treated as the inferior group. And so we'll come back to the consequences of this type of social construct of ethnicity. But we're seeing ethnicity play a role here in Central Asia. And so, you know, the Ukraine is over here, for example. But in the countries known as the stands, you can see over here the different ethnicity groups. And so even in these particular countries, you have some ethnic Russians and others that are bleeding over into the population of these now independent countries. And so you have these Slavic groups, you have these Indo-European groups, which includes Germans, and then you have these Turkic groups that make up the different populations in the stands. And so in every single one of these countries, this gray are ethnic Russians. And so this is part of the process that the USSR instituted to ensure that Russians were in every single Soviet republic. But of course this has consequences if you want to break away, and this is why Russia has a difficult time with the Ukraine at the moment, because there's a large number of ethnic Russians who would prefer to be part of Russia these days. And we can see this continuing on to play in the Middle Eastern countries as well. And so you have in Iran and Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, many different splits in religion based on whether they're Sunni or Shia. And so you can kind of see how this starts to blend together and why there's conflict in terms of ethnicity and religion in many of the hot spots around the globe. So we can see that this ethnic and national conflict occurs. And so in terms of ethnic conflict, again, we have the Balkans between these three major groups, and we'll talk about that. And then there's national conflict, and we've already talked about the case of Northern Ireland. And then there are cases where you have both ethnic and national conflict, and this is the former Soviet Union. So you see this is what's in the news today with the Ukraine and the Crimea, is a little split off of this region that's going to be going back to Russia if Russia has its way. So all of these countries used to be part of the Soviet Union, and now they are independent states, but some of them have a contentious relationship with Russia because of the ethnic Russians still living in these territories. All right, so if we think about ethnic conflict and how it begins and where it begins, there's two different schools of thought here, that sometimes it's top down, and this is where the leadership is proposing conflict, and we're going to see that is the case in the Balkans, where you have strong leadership calling for the elimination of the other in society. Or it can be bottom up, right, where you have, and this is what we see in the Rwandan genocide, where you have the masses really turning against one another. So there's these different patterns of ethnic conflict that we're going to see in these different cases, and this ethnic conflict, which is characteristic of the post-Cold War era, is where we see lots and lots of human rights violations. So we're turning back toward gross human rights violations as opposed to mainly social, economic, and cultural. Although social, cultural, and economic violations are part and parcel to why there's this difference in these different groups. You can have the pattern of exclusion, where you're wanting to exclude elements of society from participating. And so in many ways this is the beginning. We see the policy of exclusion in the apartheid system. We saw the policy of exclusion when we were looking at the Holocaust, where you start to, by law, exclude individuals from participating. And then you have removal. This is the relocation. We see the relocation occurring, forced relocations occurring in Russian history with the Chechens, for example. But you see removal in the Balkans, where people are literally being forced out of their homes. And then, of course, is the genocide, which is the ultimate form of torture, again, referring back to the Millet book. So I want to focus in on what happened in the Balkans after the end of the Cold War. So in 1984, we just had some Winter Games, so I think I'll start back with the Winter Games. In 1984, the Winter Games were held in Sarajevo. And Sarajevo is in the now country of Bosnia, but back then it was Yugoslavia. And the irony is that Sarajevo was chosen for its ethnic diversity. But if we look at what happened after the end of the Cold War, things were brewing, unbeknownst to many individuals. And it's because of this gentleman. His name is Slobodan Milosevic. In 1989, Milosevic gave a speech, and this is right toward the end of the Cold War. It's not quite over yet, but in 1989, Milosevic gave a speech for several 100,000 Serbs who had come together in Kosovo Field at the 600th anniversary of what is known as the Battle of Kosovo, where the Ottoman Turks defeated the defending Serbs. This is like the Texas Alamo, right? This is perhaps the most emotional event in Serbian national history. And so he's giving 600 years later a speech on the anniversary of this battle where the Serbs themselves had been defeated by the Ottoman Turks, by the Ottoman Empire. And so this really begins the nationalist movement. And remember, I said nationalism is this idea where you owe allegiance to your people, your nation, not your state. And this is still when Yugoslavia is a unified state. So if we go back to the map, you can see right here in the smack dab in the middle is Sarajevo. And this is the former Yugoslavia before it became independent countries. And so you had Slovenia up here, Croatia, which wraps around like so. And you can see its modern day border. And then you have the Serbs kind of dominant in this middle region here. And then you have ethnic Muslims who are scattered toward the central of the country, and then Macedonians and Kosovars and Albanians and some other smatterings of individuals. Okay. And so problems in Yugoslavia are a result of the state not coinciding with the nation. So state's a political unit and nation are the people. And Yugoslavia is located in East Europe where boundaries have changed over the course of history, many times because of wars and other powerful forces. So you have the Austrian-Hungarian Empire up here to the north that had influence in terms of Catholicism, Russians to the east where they have an influence of Orthodox, and then the Ottoman Empire in the south, which is way down here, where you get some of the converts into Islam. All right. So just to give you a little bit of background, this region is originally settled by Slavic tribes from the east, and you can kind of see this in this map up at the top, all right? And so all these individuals are coming down into the former Yugoslavia, which is down in here, all right? And so during the 5th century, the Roman Empire was split between a predominantly Catholic western part and an Orthodox east, and this border passes right through Yugoslavia. So the Serbs from the east practice the Orthodox faith and use a Cyrillic alphabet. Croatians from the from the Austrian-Hungary Empire, or the former Roman Empire. So the Croatians and the Slovenians are Catholic and they use the Latin alphabet. Well, the Ottoman Turks invaded in the 14th and 15th century, and Bosnian Muslims, you can see kind of the Ottoman Empire, then takes over part of this region. They are converted to Islam, right? So these are former Slavs, former individuals who probably ancestors migrated from the Soviet area, but now they've converted to Islam. And so between 1400 to 1918, you have a region here that's the site of rivalries among the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman Empire, and then the influence from the East. All right, so you can start to see the storm brewing here. All right. Well, before World War after World War I, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman empires collapse. And so these big empires here and here collapse after World War I. The Allies create, the winners of World War II, really create a new kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenians. And they change the name to Yugoslavia, which means the land of the Southern Slavs. So all this region, part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, part of the Ottoman Empire, all of this is made into a country called Yugoslavia, and this is what occurred after World War I. Well, of course, very soon you have World War II. And so the leader of Yugoslavia after World War II is this gentleman. His name is Marshal Tito. He was a hero in World War II as a partisan. And so he led the Yugoslavian partisans against the Nazi regime. And he was rewarded, if you will, by becoming the leader of Yugoslavia until his death in 1980. He was able to keep a tight lid on ethnic tensions. Provinces were organized roughly along ethnic lines, although there were some notable national regions, much like Bosnia. But Yugoslavia during this time was set up kind of like the United States, had a federal political system. So you had 6 republics, which we might consider states, for example, and 2 autonomous regions, kind of like Puerto Rico would be. So you had 6 states and 2 autonomous regions that made up Yugoslavia, and Marshal Tito was trying to keep a lid on all of these ethnic tensions. The breakup of the Soviet Union, however, gave ethnic groups freedom from fear of Soviet domination and freedom to express their ethnic identity. So it's as if they woke up one day and said, I've been stuck with this other ethnic group and it's been a pain in my side for the last 100 years. And these 3 ethnic groups fell into conflict. So you have the Serbs. These are dominant. These individuals are dominant in Yugoslavian politics and the army. They have an Orthodox Christianity that makes them the natural ally of Russia, and they're led by Milosevic. You have the Croats. These are Roman Catholics. They're closer to the west than Serbs and exposed to Western influence. So the Slovenian secession is quite successful. The Croatian secession is a little bit less successful, and there's war breaks out in that region. And then the Muslims, they live mainly in ethnically mixed towns and cities in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and these are the individuals who are the victims, if you will, of the ethnic conflict. And it's in this environment that you had Milosevic give his speech. All right. War breaks out. I'm not going to go into too much details of the war, but I have some graphics to show you. This right here on the left is called the Mostar Bridge, and this is one of the famous bridges that was in Yugoslavia, and it was declared a heritage site by the UN, dates back to the Middle Ages, and it's one of the first targets that you can see is gone, one of the first targets during the war in Bosnia. I started off with the Olympics. This is the former Olympic Village near the Sarajevo airport, and it lies in ruins now. And so this, according to the information, says that there's landmines nearby. So this is what's left of the the Olympic Village, Athletes Village from the Sarajevo Games. And then this is the book, the information that I asked you to read in the book for the quiz. And so this is the 10th Circle of Hell, and it's written by a journalist, and again it's written in the third person, but it is his experience, and so it was easier for him to write it as a third person, and that's not an unusual literary device to try and separate oneself from the experience. But this is the account of his life in a Serbian concentration camp, and his hometown was seized during the Balkans War. Okay, so let me get back to that. Sorry about that, because there's a clip of a video that I'd like to show you that deals with the experience in Bosnia. So I'm going to play that now and then come back to the lecture. This little segment of this video is about 6 minutes, so it's really not that long.
In Bosnia, there was deliberately a paranoid culture created prior to the war, about 5 or 6, 7 years. There was a propaganda of the Serbs being threatened by everybody else. And I know people who, because of this propaganda, good people, who genuinely believed that they are somehow threatened. So they have to attack in order to defend themselves.
As Hutu leaders did in Rwanda, the Serb leader, Slobodan Milosevic, played on beliefs his followers already held. His rallying cry was one that most Serbs would easily embrace. Under his leadership, Serbs would reclaim the land that they believed were historically theirs, including the predominantly Muslim country of Bosnia-Herzegovina. He exploited centuries-old animosities toward Muslims, whom the Christian Serbs saw as their eternal enemies.
What they're being told about Bosnians, about Muslims, they are a threat to them. Why does this make sense to them?
Because it's in harmony with the nationalist myth that many of them have been fed for generations, and the labelings of the victims that they violated during this activity fit that myth.
When those harboring powerful hatreds finally are given the chance to kill, their euphoria is unmistakable.
hari nk'umuntu wese ari umuntu icyo gihe muri leta yari irimo yumvaga ari uremereye ari muri hejuru kuko yumvaga nta kintu cyane mubasha yumvaga no muri icyo gihe n'urupfu rwabo n'inkuba itamanuka ngo umwishe yumvaga abantu bapfa ku misozi imiborogo induru zivuga abantu bapfa bashira akumva ko akomeye kugira ngo yumvaga nta yindi ngaruka yumvaga ko ari uriho yumvaga nta kintu cyamubasha yumvaga rero hagati aho nta kindi kintu cyamufata nta kindi kintu cyamubasha kumva kuriya muntu ari ugomba gupfa wenyine wenda urupfu rutazamugeraho.
In Bosnia, the Serbs' plan was comprehensive. It was described widely as ethnic cleansing, a euphemism that trivializes their brutal acts. They rounded up Muslim men and put them in concentration camps or murdered them outright. They expelled families from their homes and from regions which they wanted exclusively for Serbs. And in the capital city, Sarajevo, they attacked the civilian population from the surrounding hills.
The Bosnian Serbs fired 12 mortar and artillery rounds last night into a part of the city crowded with young people.
The sniping activity here was notorious. People walking down the street were hunted like animals.
So what would have happened to us if we had been here?
We would have been shot from those buildings over there.
How far away? I mean,
no, that's not far at all.
I mean, a sniper could hit us right here.
Oh yeah, definitely. It's not a hard shot for a trained sniper. And these were trained people. They were not. They were not yahoos with 12 gauges. These were high-powered hunting rifles. There was high-powered sniper rifles with very sophisticated sight equipment on them. And you'd be banged with a headshot. You could walk across this street in broad daylight and nothing would happen. But then, like bagging prey.
Were they just as likely to shoot women?
Yes.
And children?
Yeah.
So it had nothing to do with you being a soldier,
No.
per se?
No.
So what was the function? I mean, why were they doing this?
Terror.
Get rid of the Muslims?
Yeah.
And so terrorize them, kill as many as possible,
Yes.
make them suffer as
Push
much
as many of them
possible.
into as small an area as possible so they could take the rest.
They knew everything. They prepared everything. It was really actually planned and systematically planned, the war of actually establishing concentration camps, killing, raping, everything.
Raping is one of the worst crimes. It not only humiliates the person, it destroys the family. There is so many cases of unwanted children. The mother doesn't recognize her son or her daughter that came from these rapings.
The Serbs' widespread raping of Bosnian women was not the kind of thing, as many think, that happens inevitably in war zones.
They did nothing, actually, hasn't done anything.
Like killing, the Serbs used rape and rape camps as an integral component of their campaign to rid the country of its Muslim population.
We will never find out how many women were raped all over Bosnia. they actually closed us in some big rooms with maybe 14 beds. They are yelling at us, you will have Serbian babies, Serbian children. They were beaten, horrible beaten, with fists, with actually their legs and horrible.
Okay, so that's just a clip. If you're interested in watching more, that's on Films on Demand that you can access through the library website, and it's called Worse Than War: Genocide, Eliminationism, and the Ongoing Assault on Humanity. And so, so again, this 10th Circle of Hell, this is the book where that the information in your textbook is excerpted from. So if we just go back to the map for a moment to show this region, if we think about what happens during the war, the former Yugoslavia starts to unravel, of course. Slovenia and Croatia in 1991 declare their independence. And this is kind of an ethno-nationalistic movement where they are pretty, talk about 100% Slovenian, so they don't have the ethnic kind of breakdown. There's no Serbs living in this region, and so they break away pretty easily. So, but however, Serbia tries to keep Croatia because 12% of the population here, and you can see this in the blue, are Serbs. And so you have a 4-year war going on in the region of Croatia, and the Croatians evict most of the Serbs. And so when this all starts to break down, the Yugoslavian army, most of the equipment and many of the soldiers were ethnically Serbian, and so they kind of inherit the infrastructure of the Yugoslavian army. So they're much more well equipped to deal with warfare than some of these other ethnic groups. In 1992, Macedonia and Bosnia declared their independence. Serbs in other provinces seek a greater Serbia by annexing Bosnian land, and this is called irredentism. Irredentism is the idea of reclaiming land because you have a nation of people there that you're trying to reclaim. But this is where the ethnic cleansing is going on, mainly in this area here. And this is changing the demographic composition of villages and towns and regions and clearing land corridors to link up Serbian enclaves in Bosnia, so that these individuals living in this region can have a clear shot into the more Serbian-dominated regions. So the conflict in Bosnia here and then later in Kosovo was characterized by ethnic cleansing, and the goal, one person said, was to rid Serbian territory of Muslim residents through systematic terror and sporadic mass murder. And so the way this was carried out would be to block relief supplies that was brought on through the international community, and it was also to destroy the cities, as was described, capturing men, slaughtering men, and this is described in this book, as well as the rape of women. There's a very good documentary called Calling the Ghost, a story about rape, war, and women that deals with the experiences of Bosnian women during this particular event in history. The consequences, and if you didn't know any better, you probably would look at this picture or this picture and think of this as the Holocaust. But 50 years after the Holocaust, you're having this same thing occur in Eastern Europe, where you have over 250,000 people die through ethnic cleansing. You have 2.5 million displaced. These become refugees. And then there are camps, and Omarska is one of the most famous camps, where men and boys and then women are raped in these what are called concentration camps, of course. And again, this looks very reminiscent of during the Holocaust, but in the province of Kosovo alone, these are locations of mass graves that have been reported or found in this particular region alone. So the human rights agencies, how does the regime respond? Well, the mission by the UN Commission on Human Rights files a report on human rights violations in 1992, and this sets the UN Security Council on a path to trying to do something. In 1992, there's an arms embargo and economic sanctions placed. However, this arms embargo probably does more harm in hindsight to the Muslim population because no weapons are being brought into the region whatsoever. Not that I'm advocating this, but you have to remember that the Serbs inherited the basic Yugoslavian army, leaving many of those other ethnic groups defenseless, if you will. The UN Security Council issues a condemnation in August of 1992. Then you have the establishment of the War Crimes Commission in October of 1992, and then you have the creation of the War Crimes Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And we talked a little bit about this when we talked about international law, but this was formed in 1993, and the operation of the War Crimes Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia is still ongoing. And so you can see it's in its 13th year, its 11th year, and this shows you that international justice for war crimes is a slow-moving process. The Conference on Security and Cooperation suspended Serbian membership. It establishes a mission in the area and also does work to support the War Crimes Tribunal. But did this stop the genocide? Well, no, none of this action did because the war goes on for many years after that. In terms of humanitarian assistance, much of that assistance was blocked by the Bosnian Serbs, similar to what we're going to see in Somalia. The diplomatic pressure, the use of limited force to deliver aid, all of this was very ineffective in terms of trying to deal with the situation in the Balkans. Eventually there is a United Nations peacekeeping force. The UNPROFOR peacekeeping force is initiated. There are talks in Dayton. And so there's a long list of diplomatic efforts to try and stop the genocide. The United States in itself really didn't want to commit troops, and so this is where there's lots of bombing going on. The United States doesn't put troops on the ground really until there's a ceasefire. Many politicians in the United States think this is a European problem, but the proximity of the Balkans to Turkey and Greece pretty much made the United States need to get involved because of traditional conflict there. Ironically, while there is a UN War Crimes Tribunal, the Serbians themselves hold a War Crimes Tribunal and accuses NATO and members of NATO as well as the United States government of war crimes. So these are Serbians who are holding a War Crimes Tribunal for President Clinton and Secretary of State at the time, Madeleine Albright, in 2000 at a trial that actually began in Belgrade. And so this court puts Clinton and Albright and other leaders on trial in absentia for war crimes because of the bombing campaigns that occurred in the late 1990s. And so you had these 14 empty chairs with names assigned to them, and all of these individuals are indicted. And so they include a whole host of people that names you'll recognize: the former Defense Secretary Bill Cohen, Schroeder is the German Chancellor at the time, Tony Blair is the the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Jacques Chirac is the President of France, and all of these other individuals are being held for war crimes. All right, we'll stop that one, this lecture here, and then we'll have additional lectures on the Somalia genocide as well as the Rwandan genocide.